Hello and welcome to episode 226 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have some roster changes to talk about in the Call of Duty League. We have quite a few reports and rumors, allegations, a few of those to also discuss, including potentially a CDL team trying to leave the league and sell their spot in doing so. But, before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. First and foremost, happy Easter to anyone celebrating. We did our last show earlier this week, and I wasn't fully expecting to have too much to talk about for the weekend show, but as is tradition, I'm wrong, and we actually do have a decent amount of stuff, so it should be a decent little episode here, and I'm ready to jump right in.
Let's start with the ROSTERMANIA stuff because there was quite a few things that happened over the past week. That's kind of what you were alluding to. Like, we just had more rumors and reports come out and actual confirmations, which was probably the most surprising thing of all about these roster changes than we usually get in the week after a major. First and foremost, I think we should talk about the Carolina Royal Ravens because they seem to be one of the biggest movers and shakers, if you want to call it that, in this between period after Major 2. First of all, they have officially released Nero, and I think that is interesting because we very briefly discussed like the stuff that was going on Twitter with him and like the girl or whatever. I have not looked into it. I don't know really much about the situation, but I also don't know if it is actually the reason that he got released in this case. I think that's the easy way to explain it, is that he was in kind of like the social media ether in the last 2 weeks, and therefore that is why he's gone from the Carolina Royal Ravens. I personally have the belief that this team has just underperformed now twice at a major after having a good, like I think Major 2 qualifiers, you could be like it was a decent showing, and then obviously the Major 1 qualifiers was a great showing, and they just haven't lived up to that on LAN, and it doesn't seem like Nero will be the only roster change that they actually make before Major 3 qualifiers. But let's just focus on Nero real quick. What do you think about this move for Carolina to release him?
Yeah, I do think I believe Zuma. I saw a clip. This wasn't the clip I put in the notes, so I actually don't have it, but I'm pretty sure Zuma said that based on what he heard, the whole e-sex thing or whatever with Nero wasn't associated with um this roster move. Is purely performance based. That's allegedly according to Zuma. I think that it's possible that it's like a combination of both. It was like maybe Carolina was considering making a move, and then this whole situation pops up, and that made it like a little easier for Carolina to just be like, yeah, okay, we're gonna move on, and we can use that to kind of shield the blame or whatever. So I think it's possible that both are related, but I do think I mean, I've sung Nero's praises before. I do think he is inconsistent at times in term, like he has this incredible pop off potential. It never is super consistent, or it's always like a very very big high, and then the next game or the next series he's like 18 and 30 or something like that. So a bit of inconsistency issues have plagued him over the years, but he always has that potential to pop off, and this was really the first year we saw him uh in more of an AR role than an SMG role, and I wasn't a big fan of that move at first, like before the season or anything. But then once they brought Exceed into the roster, and it was really two SMG players running the ARs for Carolina, they had their moments in the qualifiers where it worked out. Um, but I will be interested to see if this Carolina team. I mean, there are other reports too of them potentially looking to move on from Exceed as well. I would be interested to see how this Carolina team performs if they were to get like true tested ARs. Like obviously it's a tougher thing Not saying they're going to get like veterans or something, but somebody who's been around the block a little bit more as an AR than like Nero and Exceed, who seemingly have made that transition or attempted to make that transition within less than the last year. So, um, at least on the Nero front, we can get into the other side of this Carolina stuff later. But on the Nero front, I will be interested to see specifically with him, um, assuming he gets on a challengers team, what he does with that opportunity in terms of, does he continue to run an AR? Does he go back to running an SMG? Maybe it was a situation where his only shot to be in the CDL was to take an AR opportunity with Carolina, and that's more like potentially part of the reason why he did it. And now that he's no longer with Carolina, maybe he goes back to being that roaming first blood esque, like super aggressive SMG. Um, not sure, but I think there are some interesting possibilities there.
Yeah, they're in a tough spot because currently they're in ninth place in the standings. So if the season were to end today, they wouldn't make it to champs. And that's really just because of their land performances. They have not won a match on land, of course, this season. They had 5 straight wins going into Major 1. Then they get double first rounded, and they looked really bad in doing so. They weren't necessarily the closest matches, which was extraordinarily disappointing for a team that we thought might be a surprise contender going into that major. And then in Major 2, they have they go into the play-in and they lose to Paris. I think it's a tough draw, to be honest, like to play the defending major champions in the play-in, even though Paris had obviously underperformed and deserved to be in that play-in. It just was kind of a tough draw for Carolina, and they lose that match and therefore don't make it into the bracket and don't really get anything out of that other than, a quick trip to England. Like, that doesn't seem to be a great thing for Carolina. So I can't blame them for making really any changes at this point. I think we should also mention what you kind of alluded to was that Carolina, according to Ronnie Intel, they are looking at potentially bringing in a Luka as a solution for this. And obviously, a Luka, I believe, has played both AR and SMG in challengers this season. Of course, he kind of broke out on the AR at the beginning of the season, but he's a FaZe Vegas substitute. I don't know if they're really itching to make a change at the current moment coming off the Major 2 championship. He's also been in challengers, and he's torn it up a few times. I don't know if that's like super consistent all the time, but he would be a very interesting pickup. And then the last bit in the last paragraph, I believe it is, in the Ronnie Intel article on Breaking Point, is that there are a few teams interested in acquiring Lurks, which is intriguing, I will say, because we've talked about this kind of thing with Nasty, specifically with the Boston Breach, and how if you're on a bad team, sometimes maybe a bad team might let you go to a better team to compete because you're just kind of above their level. They can't really field a competitive roster around you. It would be interesting if that happened to Lurks. It did. The article did say that a buyout seems unlikely, but that teams are actively exploring options for a potential move. Which I wonder what these teams are, to be honest. Because Lurks has looked really good, and we talked about it just a few weeks ago that he certainly has made a pretty good case for Rookie of the Year, and I think he'll probably continue to make that case even on a bad Carolina roster. We saw Gwen do the same just a few years ago, but I want to get your thoughts on this. So just first, the Aluka part of it and that potentially coming to fruition and him making a CDL debut, and also your boy Lurks potentially, probably not, I guess, moving on from Carolina.
Well, I think it's at this point, especially if Carolina is looking to make multiple roster moves, I think it is pretty foolish to not try and capitalize on this opportunity. It seemed like heading into this season that potentially the Royal Ravens organization was looking to sell its spot, which ironically is something else we'll be talking about at some point in this show, not necessarily directly with Carolina, but regardless, there was that whole space station saga with Carolina, and like they potentially didn't get the paperwork filed on time or whatever. Lots of rumors and reports around that. But especially if that is the case, I think trying to capitalize on Lurks' hot start and strong performance in stage two, or the major two cycle there. I think financially that makes a ton of sense for Carolina. I just don't know if they're actually going to pull the trigger and be willing to move on from him. Um, Tying it in with the Aluka stuff, and I've got another name that somebody else that we have mentioned before, and I have specifically mentioned multiple times when we've had these AR conversations, is Cobra. And I think obviously the one major issue with Cobra is him being a EU player and the whole visa process most likely taking too long to try to um actualize, or whatever, the get it all finalized and situated, whatever the actual phrasing of that is. So in a scenario here, it would suck from an Aluka perspective, but technically, if Aluka is signed to FaZe could loan him out for just major three. Let's just say it would really suck, especially if Aluka like came into the league and popped off. So I don't think this is what they would do, but technically Aluka could be loaned to Carolina in time, or for like they could just say like loan him until you're able to work something out with Cobra, and then Cobra, once the visa situation is finalized, he could come into the roster. Um like I said, that wouldn't be a great situation. Obviously, I think it would be really cool if they were able to just get Aluka and Cobra right now and have them be the two ARs with Craze and Lurks. I think that would be a pretty exciting team with some rookie talent, and it might not necessarily be a contender right away, but it would definitely be a team that would be much more exciting for some fans to want to watch. But I think there are multiple things or roadblocks, obstacles, whatever, preventing that from potentially happening. So it is worth mentioning that there was that whole EWC situation last year where Carolina was trying to get Cobra and Afro, and I think F Dot was the other guy. It was one of those EU players. I'm pretty sure that was him. They were trying to get like three EU guys to play with Slasher after Gwen left and TJ left or whatever for EWC. So
Mm-hmm.
it's possible that Carolina may be able to, like if EWC didn't rule against that roster, they potentially could have had the capability of getting a quick turnaround on visa stuff, or maybe they, it was different because it would only be for EWC. I don't know. Whole lots of ifs and buts there, but end of the day, I would be super excited about Aluka getting an opportunity in the league. I just don't know, like, logistically how likely that is, or how long it would be, because like I said, if they loan him out and it's only just like a short term thing and then he goes back to being a sub, like I think that's like that doesn't do him justice. And then, like, let's just say Aluka has a bad start to his CDL tenure, that kind of like, that'll be a reputation that follows him and kind of undoes all the insane PR that he got at the start of this year. Um, so the Lucas situation is a little weird, but I do think, I mean, it doesn't make sense for Boston, but we talked about the Boston Omid situation, and with Aluka, I'm pretty sure Aluka is under contract with Omit too, but maybe that changed with the FaZe situation. I don't know. Lots of ifs here. So regardless, I think I would like to see Aluka in the league. I said that months ago when that was a possibility. I'm worried about how it would work out with him if it did happen with Carolina. From the Lurks perspective, I think, I think Carolina would just be super foolish if some team is offering a ton of money that could potentially be used to facilitate the rest of the roster for the rest of this year, and then potentially, like, you know look good on the books in terms of a pending sale or rebrand or whatever in the following season. Like, I think that's like from a business perspective, I think it makes sense to try and move Lurks if other teams are interested, but from a pure Call of Duty perspective, it makes sense to also hold on to him. And then, yeah, just I guess shout out Cobra. I don't think he's going to get a shot here, but it would be an interesting opportunity, and it's a team he's been linked to in the past.
Yeah, the visa issues are always going to linger for any non-American player. We even talked about it with Aluka specifically when he was picked up by FaZe, that he's a German national player, and even though I believe that he was residing in the United States, it's different because he was going to school in the United States, but this would be like a professional visa, if I'm not mistaken, and that might take months at a time. And I believe people even weighed in, like former players and coaches and stuff had weighed in and said like this sometimes takes a really long time, and it could affect like where he's able or when he's able to play in the CDL. So hopefully that's all kind of worked out on his end. But as far as Cobra or any other non-American player, like, yeah, it's probably going to be a really tough road for them. It's going to have to most likely be an off-season change for a lot of those players, just because it gives them months at a time to kind of like runway essentially before the matches actually begin. We even saw Trakes, and he had some of the same issues to start the season. As far as Carolina goes, I think it's understandable to want to bring in Aluka. I think it's understandable for FaZe even to want him to get experience in the CDL, because right now he's had a good challenger season, and that's all well and good. But we've seen so many players go from tearing it up in challengers to the CDL, and they just kind of look out of their depth. And not saying that they're necessarily not up to it, but this is a pretty big jump in skill from challengers to the CDL. And you see it probably more often in the reverse, where former CDL players who really aren't performing very well in the CDL fall down into challengers and then just absolutely rip off like a month or two of like really incredible play and then get bumped back up to the CDL. So I think him, even if it was, like you said, a weird arrangement where he's just there for like the major 3 qualifiers and major 3, and then FaZe like recalls him, like maybe they want to make a roster change at that point and they bring him back, that would still give him like whatever it would be, like 8-9 matches of CDL action before he gets to FaZe. And you kind of avoid what we were worried about with guys like Neum and Kips, where they just haven't played and you're expecting a lot of them to turn around your team. And I would assume that if FaZe were to make a roster change at, I guess, any point in the near future, it would be to kind of turn them around to get them back to where they are just currently. So it's a really weird situation if Aluka does end up getting to Carolina. But I would, like you said, I would be very, very happy for him. I think it's always really fun to see the rookies get a shot in the CDL and someone who's just never been here before, and see how they react and what effect he would have on Carolina, because they could make champs. It is not, I don't think that they're in a C9 situation where it just looks increasingly unlikely that they're even going to make it into the top 8. Carolina has a really good shot. They are able to beat the bottom teams a lot of times, and that's kind of how they've made their bread and butter. But they've also beaten LAT very, I guess, infamously at this point. And I think that could happen, especially with how inconsistent we've seen a lot of these teams that are kind of in that upper echelon or like the mid tier, how inconsistent they can be. I think they can win a lot of those matches or win them enough to get into the top 8. So I want to see what Carolina does, regardless if it's a Luka or it's somebody else. And if they get rid of Lurks, then I think that's waving the white flag, so to speak. It does not seem like you would be really looking to be a contender or maybe even get to champs if you're selling one of your best players. I don't know if that's going to happen. It does, according to Ronnie, it's unlikely, but the fact that it's being even mentioned, it does seem pretty interesting on a face value. I think we should also kind of flip to Vancouver, because I think they're kind of in a similar situation in a way. One, they're in the bottom 4 because they have stunk for quite a bit. But I was just thinking about this. So like there's a rumor that Vancouver was the team that was trying to sell their CDL spot. But we'll get to that part later. But somebody pointed out that if they are in like millions of dollars of debt, then they didn't take the offer. And we know that they didn't take the offer for Pred a few years ago when Optic wanted to acquire him. And it was reportedly like 500, 600, 700, whatever it was, $700,000. But like that's a very interesting kind of flashpoint with Carolina. And if obviously Lurks is not a Pred, Seattle Surge Pred, but like the idea is that they might turn down some money, like you said, even though it might be good on the books, to try to field a more competitive roster. Now Vancouver is just like not doing either. They're not really making any money. They're not being competitive. And now they're even replacing Capsidal, who they had just brought in. And I don't really get this move. I haven't really understood a lot of the Vancouver Surge moves this season. It doesn't seem like they've really had a rhyme or reason why they're doing things throughout the year. We talked about it at the beginning of the season when they had this like really young, inexperienced roster, and we both said you have to let them cook. Like if unless they can't win a match or whatever, like just let them go for a while and then let's see what happens. And then you can kind of make your decision after that. They didn't do that. They made a roster really early in the season. And while they've been better, that's undeniable. They've not been good. And they're still one of the worst teams. And now we're in a spot where who knows what this roster really even looks like going into the Major 3 qualifiers. So Caps was released and maybe even Gwyn is moving and swapping roles, which I don't know. Like Gwyn has obviously not had a great season, but this team has not been constructed well at all. What do you think about this idea that Vancouver could be really overhauling this team before they get to the Major 3 qualifiers?
Yeah, I could not disagree more with the decision to move on from Capsidal this quickly. I thought when he immediately, right when he was inserted into the lineup, I know I mentioned it at the time whenever those like initial matches would have been for him. He wasn't having these like pop off statistical games like we saw from challengers, but he was having a ton of engagements and he was clearly impacting the map because it felt like Vancouver was competitive in some of the matches where they were still losing after the roster change, and then we finally saw like towards the end of the qualifiers, like I'm pretty sure Capsidal, I'm pretty sure it was the first hard point against Vancouver against Falcons when Vancouver beat Falcons. I'm pretty sure one of the maps in that series, I believe it would have been the first hard point. Capsidal like had a pop off performance there, and I remember talking about it saying like that this is the Capsidal I was expecting. But even when he wasn't in like that takeover mode that we saw from him down in Challengers with the Bush, he was clearly like having a ton of engagement and setting the pace for this team and was just providing like an opportunity for Vancouver to be more competitive in some of these maps that they just previously were not competitive in. So I really think they kind of did, Capsidal dirty in the sense of calling him up and getting him off of the best challengers team and then just releasing him. And now, like, what does the Bush do? Does the Bush try and get him back? Because obviously he was a big part of their team. Or are they just going to stick with their current roster and Capsule's going to have to find another team in the Challengers? So it's you go back to the beginning of the season with Vancouver, there were rumors and allegations and stuff about like Vancouver potentially setting Legend up to fail, like not even giving him the proper attachments and all that yada yada. And you could argue that they did Legend dirty in that sense, and I would definitely argue they did Capsidal dirty in this sense because I don't think he was the problem with this team. I think I guess this is really a situation where they clearly want to build around this Lunars and Gwen duo. There was even like in the little content we saw from Vancouver at the start of the year, they talked about their friendship and Lunars talked about how he really wanted to play with Gwen and that was a part of them coming together and forming this team, and it feels like they're doing everything to keep them together. And like you mentioned, this hasn't. I'm without even looking at the numbers, I'd feel pretty confident in saying this is Gwynn's worst year in the CDL yet. Obviously, that there are worse comparisons to make for other players statistically when you're saying like a rookie of the year is having his worst year in year 3, but. Nevertheless, I think potentially swapping back to the SMG for Gwyn could help him in that regard. But I just think like I feel for Capsidal, and I hope it works out for him in the end because he had the C9 situation at the end of last year where he got like a very minimal run, and then he was released before EWC, I believe, and now this is another situation where he wasn't even picked up like early in the Major 2 qualifier. So I'm not like maybe he played 5 matches total with Vancouver. I don't even know. But yeah, I think it's a really crappy situation for Capsidal, and I'm hoping it works out for him. For Vancouver, I just really I don't know what the whole situation is there, or why they seemingly are so set on sticking with. Especially, I know there's the previous chemistry between TJ and Gwyn too, but even Capsule had played with Gwyn and TJ at different points, so it's like you can say it for one player that they're trying to stick friends together, and in other situations they're foregoing that to make a move. So I don't really know what the deal is there. I will say, reportedly, according to Ronnie Intel, they're trying to, they're potentially trialing Brack and Beans for the AR slot on this team, which would have Gwyn go to the SMG with TJ, and then Lunars with a new AR. If they get Brack, I'll call it like a net neutral move because I have been a huge proponent of Brack over the years, and I think he's really belonged in the league since his uh, Florida Mutineers saga in MW2. I believe that was maybe that was MW3. I don't even remember the recent Modern Warfare titles, but when Brack was playing well on Florida in his last CDL stint, he was like, for whatever reason, the community was just not like on board with the way he was playing, and saying he was like kill whoring and all this stuff. But I liked what he was doing, and I thought he was playing well statistically. So I've said, you know, I've felt he's belonged in the CDL, or at least deserving of another chance. And um if Capital has to be the sacrifice here to get Brack another chance, I'm gonna, from a personal bank standpoint, I'm gonna be like, it is what it is. I lose one guy I really like, and I get another guy I really like back in the league. But um, yeah, we'll have to wait and see how this all plays out, I guess.
I would love to hook Gwen up to a lie detector and ask him whether he regrets signing with Vancouver in the offseason. I would love to hear what offers he had, because I know that his reputation has not been sterling by any means. He's obviously had issues with like Envoy and like the former LAT guys, and people have called him an onliner for like years at this point, even though I believe like at champs last year he had like one of his best events ever, even though obviously Carolina didn't do anything at champs. That being said, like it's just, I just don't know if Vancouver knows what they're doing. I don't, I think they're just kind of winging it, and that's a really bad way to, or I guess a really good way to get out of champs, and it's a very bad way to run a team. It just, it doesn't make sense that they went into this season, and like you said, I think that they do value Lunars and Gwyn as a duo, and they want to build around them. So if you wanted to build around them, like Gwyn had 2 years of professional experience, I believe, before this season. And then Lunars had less than 1 year because he came in after Major 1 last season. So combined, they have less than 3 years of professional experience between the two of them. Why would you put them with guys that were also rookies or had barely played? Like, why would you put them with Legend, a guy who had never played competitive Call of Duty, any point in his life. He was a professional Halo player, a very good one, but like he was coming in, he had no experience in Call of Duty, let alone the CDL. And then you also put him with Abe. Abe had like what, one event of like CDL experience, even though it wasn't technically the CDL. Like that is ridiculous. Like how can you value Gwyn and Lunars and then put them with guys that are also trying to learn how to be a professional player? It would make sense to have TJ on this roster. It would make sense to have Capsidal on this roster because those are guys. TJ's obviously been around a lot longer than anybody, but even Capsidal has like had multiple runs in the CDL. He does essentially understand what it is to be a pro player and what the differences are between being in challengers and being a pro. But like, what's the solution now? Okay, like, are you going to get rid of TJ? It doesn't seem like that. It seems like they're just going to roll swap TJ and Gwyn and just kind of rock with that. Or if you bring him back, like he obviously has a ton of experience, but at the same point though, like he's been in challengers most of his career, at least most of the CDL, I guess, because he was on that Toronto Ultra team back in 2020. But I don't know how much he even played on that team. I'm not sure if he was one of those players that kind of rode the bench. Like you said, he was with Florida for a little bit, but like he's played a lot in challengers, not as much in the pros. And will that actually make this team any better? Because if you're kind of just treading water, then what is the point? Like, why wouldn't you just sell Gwyn, sell Lunars? Like, maybe it's just that you've tanked their value so much now that you don't really have any kind of avenue to go down. Like it's really just, we have to stick with this roster. I just don't get it. I don't get what their plan was. It seemed like at the beginning of the season, we talked about this. It seemed like the plan was we're going to take all four of these guys that have like 4 years of competitive experience combined, and we're going to let them just like play together. They're going to learn together. They're going to make mistakes together, but they're going to get better together. And then maybe they become something at the end of the season. Maybe they don't, but we can maybe sell off players. We're a farm team for other teams. I think a lot of that would have made sense. And yet, like, here they are, and Capsidal was one of the best challengers players. They bring him up, and I looked it up. He played 7 matches, I'm pretty sure, with Vancouver because he played 6 qualifiers and then the play-in match. So it was literally just about a month, like maybe 32 days that he was on this roster. What's the plan? Like, was it always the plan that you were going to get rid of Capsidal? What did you think Capsidal was going to do to this team? Like, he's not like Mercules or anything. Like, he's not going to take your team and put you in the grand finals of this tournament. You guys finished, I believe, 7th in the qualifiers. Like, I mean, that's like about where you would expect a Vancouver Vancouver, excuse me. I was thinking of Carolina, but Vancouver was whatever, they were 9th or 10th or whatever it was. Like, that's exactly where they were always expected to be. Like, that's where you were before. You were even a little bit better because you won a few matches with him. I just don't get it. Like, I don't really get what they're going for. I don't know what the long-term plan is, if there is a long-term plan. I would love to hear from, the coaching staff and like the front office for Vancouver and just like explain what your thought process is. Like from October on, what was the plan in October? What is the plan in April? And has that changed? What are you planning to do for the next 2 months to make sure that you aren't one of those 4 teams that don't make it to champs? I don't understand.
I mean, obviously it sucks that they went all the way to Birmingham and only played 1 series and then they were eliminated, but you could argue that that's better than what was anticipated, because I'm pretty sure most people, if you ask them heading into the Major 2 qualifiers, they would have said that C9 and Vancouver were the 2 teams that wouldn't be at Major 2, right? So yeah. I think at least, whether they finished 8th or 9th, I think they finished 9th in the qualifiers. That's still slightly better than what they were likely expected to finish, which was most likely 11th in most people's eyes, and missing the tournament as a whole.
Yeah, and again, Brack and Beans as like a potential solution. I mean, I've never been on the Beans train. I not to like hate on him or anything, but like I see him in very much the same vein as Capsidal. Like, he's not going to make or break your roster, but like why make the change in the first place if that's not the case? Like wouldn't you try to be swinging for the fences with some of these moves? Because right now there are still one of the worst teams. Like, I think you could make a good argument that they're the third worst team because Boston might be below them now. But C9 is certainly below them, and Boston might be. So I think at best, they're the third best team in the CDL, right? And, like, I don't think that's going to change if Beans and or Brack. Like, even if you made two changes, I just don't see that making like a massive difference as far as your standing in the CDL. So why make those moves in the first place? Like, why is Beans or Brack any better than Capsidal in this? Like, Capsidal was like one of, if not the best challengers player until he got called up. He was on one of the top challengers teams consistently. He was kind of their crown jewel effectively. And then you brought him up, and then a month later you get rid of him. So I don't know what the plan is. I would love to hear from them about that. I do want to shift gears real quick because, like I mentioned, the rumor was that Vancouver was trying to sell their spot. So Zuma went on his stream and he said that he had heard that a CDL organization had asked for $6.5 million for their spot. Zuma was asked to pay $6.5 million for a CDL spot. And then Ghost of Hope in the comments said, it's Surge. I heard they're almost that much in debt, so it would make sense for it to be them. I bring that up, obviously, because we're talking about Vancouver. Even if it's not Vancouver, we've talked so much about expansion and teams selling their spots. If I was a prospective owner, if I was trying to get into the CDL, I would not touch a $6.5 million check with a 90-foot pole. Maybe it's like worth like, I don't know, like $650,000, but $6.5 million, you have to be out of your fucking mind. Like, when are you going to make $6.5 million back on a team like that? I get it from, obviously reportedly, I guess, I don't know if Hope is actually reporting it because I don't know if he's allowed to do that anymore, but like allegedly, if it is the Surge, I get it from their perspective, right? I understand why you would ask, like, hey, will you help us get out of debt? That's very common in like mergers and acquisitions, that companies will essentially consume the debt that they're buying, like the company that they're buying. That makes a lot of sense. But if you're the Stallions, if you're Rise Nation, if you're whoever, Liquid, Fnatic, I don't know what other Envious, like whatever organizations want to get in, why the hell would you pay $6.5 million? What do you think about all this?
Yeah, I got a lot. First and foremost, I do not think that like Zuma should be entitled to like a quote unquote discount or whatever. You hear in sports, roster or free agency and all that stuff. Like you hear like players taking a hometown discount or whatever the phrasing you want to use. I'm not saying that Zuma is like entitled to that or anything like that, but I just think from a pure business perspective, asking a single person like Zuma to be like, yeah, we want 6.5 million for the spot is essentially just telling him to go F himself and that you're not doing business with him, right? Like it's effectively, I mean, it's a little, obviously Zuma's a millionaire and probably a multi-millionaire at this point, but if a CDL team asked you or me for like, $65,000, that's the equivalent of asking Zuma for 6.5 million. Like, it's like, you're basically like setting the bar so high that they're going to say no. And I think that's my issue with this in the grand scheme of things, not even from a Zuma perspective, is it's something I have mentioned multiple times since the CDL announcement came out that they were forgiving past entry fees or whatever the phrasing you want to use. I've said it now, is like going back to when Immortals had the OGLA spot and then it was sold to LAT, and that's just like one of those like first transactions that comes to mind. how was that handled from these like forgiveness perspective, or was it just not? And if that's the case, how would future transactions between teams be handled? Because you're effectively in this situation, if it is the Surge was one of those original teams. Obviously, I think it's changed hands now, um, potentially, because I don't think it's Luminosity now, or Luminosity got bought by somebody. But
Luminosity got bought,
technically,
yeah.
yeah. But technically, like the brand is still like one of those. Like the Surge have been in the CDL since the beginning, so that initial fee that they were purportedly going to have to pay would have been forgiven, and they're essentially, if it is reportedly the Surge, they would be essentially asking anybody to pay 6.5 million for a spot that they got for free. Which again, now if it's changed hands, they may not have gotten it for free, and that's been my question over these last couple of years is how that all is handled. Because then, if this current ownership didn't get the Surge for free, how did the previous owner that they got it from justify selling them a spot that they got for free? You know what I mean? So somebody
Mhm.
eventually essentially got this spot for free, and in theory potentially sold it. It's basically like they were like grandfathered in to get this spot, and then they were willing to make a profit off it. That's been my like huge, like major question mark that I've had around all this stuff involving potential uh spots being sold and all that stuff since that CDL announcement, when they said that those initial franchise fees were being forgiven. Um so I especially like you said, from a Zuma perspective, it makes absolutely no sense for him to even consider 6.5 million. That's just absolutely crazy. And I think it's been pretty clear that the CDL is like more aware and open-minded to the contributions of these challengers teams like Omit, like the Bush, like Stallions and Zuma. And I think that could, in theory, make them more likely to do expansion with those specific teams in mind than they previously were. I also think at the end of the day, it's been pretty obvious over these years that expansion just seemingly isn't close to happening, and it might be like a situation where until the CDL is done and dusted and it eventually goes back to like a more open ecosystem, those teams might just be on the outside looking in. And I think if that's the case, that's a win for Zuma in the sense of like he could, in theory, get to a point where he has a professional team with the Stallions, and he doesn't have to make this absolutely ridiculous investment in just to acquire a spot. That's not even accounting for how much Zuma would want to, invest in a roster. Knowing Zuma and his competitive nature and stuff, he wouldn't want to be that type of guy who's just like paying the minimum to have some players. Maybe at first he would be like doing his Stallions esque challengers roster, but eventually it would get to a point, in my eyes at least, where Zuma would want to be like a super competitive owner and have a really good team and investing a lot of money. So then you're talking about over $10 million invested with the spot purchase plus paying for the roster and all that stuff. So it's a ton of money that could potentially just be like you pump the brakes a little bit, you wait for things to see how the dust settles and all that, and um it might not be as expensive if it all plays out that way. I do think um the other thing specifically with Zuma being asked about the spot that he said in the clip is something I mentioned the last time we talked about this too, is that he would have to leave phase if he was to uh get a CDL spot, or do his thing in that fashion. And he made it pretty clear in that clip that that is not something he's looking to do right now, and obviously that makes a ton of sense to me too. So I think um while this is all like an interesting topic to discuss, it seems like it's not something that's going to come to fruition, at least on the Zumba perspective. But regardless of just this one example from Zuma and everything. I just think we've heard, and we were just talking about potentially like the space station gaming with Carolina situation and all that. If Surge is asking for 6.5 million, is that like where the bar is set low, or is that what all these teams are going to be looking for, or is that just a Surge specific thing? That's again, we don't even know if it is technically the Surge, but just reportedly, allegedly, all that. Um, is that number like the minimum, or is that like a really high bar to be set at, or are some of these other teams that might move gonna bump it down a little bit? And I think that would make it more likely for some of these other organizations that actually have like financial backing and stuff, and it's not just Zuma, who's a streamer, potentially looking to swing in. But I still think at the end of the day, it's crazy that some of these teams might be trying to turn a profit on a spot that at one point was potentially given to somebody for free.
Well, I mean, what was it? $25 million was the buy-in reportedly back in 2019. Somebody in the comments of that tweet said that Falcons paid $2 million for their spot in the CDL, which I don't know if that's true. Obviously, like I remember something something being said or reported about that number, but I don't know if that's true. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it is. There's no way that Vancouver then is like valued at three and a half times what Falcons is. Like, even like obviously the Surge historically have had more success. I wouldn't say a ton more success than what the Paris/Vegas Legion had in the CDL. But what people also need to realize is that these business deals are not done based, or should not be done based on past results or past success. It should be about future success. And it's like me buying, like, I don't know, like some ABA team that hasn't been around for like, I don't know, like 45, 50 years at this point, and then being like, well, back in the day, they made like $3 million in a single year. That shit doesn't matter, obviously, because they won't make any money for the next 50 years, right? If I buy anything and it's a piece of junk now, I'm not getting it based on when it was good back then or what it might have been valued back in 2019. I'm getting it valued like what it can do for me tomorrow, what it can do for me in a year or 2 years. And that is basically the situation that Vancouver's found themselves in, is that I'm sure that they're like, that number makes sense to me. $6.5 million. If they're in debt that much money, that kind of makes sense. Like, considering they were probably paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, potentially like over $1 million per year in salary. Who knows of the staffing requirements that they've had, facilities, all of that stuff. That to me makes a lot of sense, how you could basically get in $1 million per debt for every year that you're in the CDL. To that point, though, nobody is obligated to help you out of that hole. That is a hole that you chose to, one, get in and then continue to dig in. So that's your fault, not anybody else's. The only thing that can make people pay that kind of money, or anywhere close to it, or any, like, I think significant amount, is that there are only 12 spots, and that there might be another person or organization that is willing to pay more than the spot is actually worth. Which I think, again, like I said, 650,000 would make a lot more sense than 6.5 million, because you could say 650,000, I can basically field a roster for that much. So let's just double our debt. And at that point, we're at like 1.3 million. We're probably never going to make that back anyway. So or it's going to be years and years until we make that back. So like, it's still kind of not a good deal for me, because I'm just losing money on this deal. But you could make the argument. And if Envious, for example, were to say, hey, we'll pay you $2 million for the spot, because we know that there are other organizations circling and they want to get in. So we'll swoop in, we'll pay more than really what we should, and we'll get the spot. At the same point, like, will this spot be worth anything in a year, 2 years, 3 years? Like what we just saw the Overwatch League die like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, whatever it is now. Like those spots are worthless, right? Like if you bought in like a year or two before the demise, like what did you get out of it? Like did you get some kind of deal afterwards that like the Activision backed like CWL return is going to guarantee you a spot in the 16 team league, or what's the deal? And I would, if I were either Zuma or anybody else interested in buying one of these spots, I would be very clear to both the team that is trying to sell me a spot and the CDL itself, because I think that's probably the big part is like, I want guarantees from Activision or Microsoft. I don't care about like what these people in the Vancouver Surge are telling me. I want Microsoft to come and tell me and put it in writing that like, if this league goes belly up, that I'm not going to lose my $2-3 million that I invested into the league. And I think that's important. I don't know why, and it seems like Zuma wouldn't pay that amount. I don't know why anyone would really pay that amount, because I mean, you might wait 6 months and the Surge might sell the spot back to the CDL at like 30 cents on the dollar, and then the CDL sells the spot for even less than that. Like the CDL is more willing and more able to take a massive loss than Vancouver probably is. And I think that it would probably just be prudent to kind of hold out and see how far down the price would go for Vancouver or any other team. I shouldn't just continue to parrot that this is Vancouver. It could be C9. It could be any team, really. Like, I mean, the only team that is really worth anything is Optic. And because you're not going to buy 100 Thieves. You're not going to buy FaZe or whatever for $6.5 million. So I don't know what other team it could be, but I just think this is a very interesting and thing that we should continue to watch, right? The discount part of it, like, I will say, I don't really care whether Zuma gets a CDL spot. Like, I don't personally have any interest, but I will say that the CDL should be willing to give discounts to prospective owners who can prove that they are stable and that they are willing and able to invest into the CDL for the next 3 to 5 years or something like that. I don't know what the timetable would be, but I think the fact that the CDL has kind of shirked that responsibility over the years, that we've had multiple instances where players have alleged that they're not getting paid, or not only players, but like support staff are alleging, like obviously the London or Ravens, this happened with where they were saying, hey, we're not getting paid for months and months at a time. I think this happened with the Vegas Legion. It might have happened with some other teams that I don't remember at this point. And obviously like the Boston Breach having the layoffs that they did, LAG back when it was the Gorillas and the Guard esports organization, they had layoffs during the middle of the season. What the CDL should be doing is like, yeah, we can take $4 million from the shady businessman, or we can take $1 million from this actual like stable organization or group of businessmen that can actually invest into what we want, and that we know that they're not going to just one day pack everything into their car and drive away as if they're like stealing $3 million or taking people's livelihoods away from them. So I think that's what the CDL should be focusing on, is just making sure that the organizations that come into the league are stable and they're not shady, because I just think like there's no reason to even have a CDL in the first place if you can't police that and you can't prevent that. Like that was one of the major reasons that you did in the first place, right? To get rid of Denial Esports and Red Reserve, to not have those kind of organizations in your league. And I don't feel like they've actually done that. So that's pretty disappointing from my perspective. But I guess we're gonna have to keep watch on this, right? Like I don't know if we're gonna hear much more about the like how sales are going until they probably happen. But it would kind of be another tradition, or continuing the tradition for the CDL to have more teams change every offseason, which I don't believe that we've ever had a CDL offseason where something hasn't changed, whether it be a relocation, a team sale, name change or something. It feels like we've had that every single year that the CDL has existed. So I wouldn't expect that to be any different come this offseason. Let's talk about the map pool because this was something we have talked about quite at length, I think, at this point. But apparently, according to Ronnie Intel of Breaking Point, there will be an increased map pool and new maps incoming. So he said that obviously we talked about the ranked play additions on the last episode, where basically, former competitive maps like Yemen or Clifftown, in this case, Gridlock, Fringe, and Plaza, a few others will be tested as part of the ranked play map rotation in all 3 game modes. And Ronnie Intel kind of added on to this. He said currently there's an interest in adding more maps to the professional rotation. The current plan is to add 2 maps to each mode while removing 1. However, some professional players have expressed concerns that Blackheart Hardpoint might remain, as the CDL apparently desires, quote, variety in the map pool so that the same maps aren't consistently played in the series. And he said that some sources have suggested that exposure could be removed to an in-game glitch that affects the map's playability. So 6 hardpoint maps, 6 S&D maps, 4 overload maps. Everything would increase by 1 map in the pool, and that the overall map pool would go from 13 currently to 16. I have been a big proponent on flooding the zone, of just throwing all the maps out there and telling people to go fuck themselves, because then you get some really chaotic series. Teams have not really practiced these maps nearly as much, and you have to be more strategic with your vetoes at that point. What do you think about this idea that there could be 2 maps added, 1 removed for each of these 3 game modes in the major 3 qualifiers?
Yeah, I mean, we both said it enough. We want some new maps in the map pool. I think the biggest thing for me with this specific report is that I don't know if they would also have to change the veto system, or if they would just keep the veto system and then just allow some maps to just not be used in a series. Feels like that is the most likely scenario, but that would be a little weird in terms of how it all shakes out. It would definitely benefit things for the grand finals of these majors, because then there would be more maps in play, and that would give, at least in theory, it would give that winner's bracket team a little bit more of an advantage, because they would be able to potentially force some teams onto maps that they weren't even including in their vetoes previously. At the same time, you could argue too that adding more maps to the pool is a disadvantage for the winner's bracket team, because I believe, as things stand right now, based on the map pool, I'm pretty sure the losers bracket team doesn't get to veto an overload, just because like you veto won't know. That doesn't make sense, because you veto and then you pick. But I'm pretty there's something in the because in the grand finals there's 2 overloads, so the
you just
losers
veto
team
which one
doesn't
you don't
get
want
to
to play.
so the losers team doesn't get to veto an overload currently. If you add 1 overload map, then they would get to. You're adding a veto there based on the current system. So I'm not sure logistically how that would work out from a veto perspective and all that, but definitely I'm a huge fan of getting the maps in. I think this would be the first time in the CDL era that we would have like a 6-6-4 breakdown for the map pool. I think there were other instances where there was maybe 6 hardpoint maps or 6 search maps at different times in different titles. I'm trying to think back, but I feel like especially in the last few games, they've been pretty much sticking to this 5-5-3, so that it would definitely be a slight change. But I definitely want to see some new maps in the pool. If this is what it takes, I'm all for it. I do think it's pretty funny that Blackheart might survive even if new maps come in.
Yes.
The exposure glitch has been a thing, like during the last major. Seemingly almost every time an exposure started, the map had to be restarted before it actually got to be played. I don't know what the exact glitch is, but I know I've seen people on the timeline talking about it and complaining about it and stuff. But I feel like the map is one of the better maps in the game and is actually somewhat enjoyable to watch. So I think that would kind of suck if we lost exposure because of a glitch. At the same time, we talked about this with Blackheart ironically earlier in the year, like remove exposure for now, fix the glitch, and then if you get it fixed up, you can bring it back into the pool for like stage 4 or the end of the year. And then it's not like this like super drastic change where you're adding a brand new map to the pool before the biggest events of the year. You're adding a map that these players have played for multiple months now. They just will have like a slight break on it that potentially fixes it and makes it better. So, um, end of the day, we'll have to see how it works out. I definitely want some new maps in the pool, but biggest thing for me, as I poorly outlined but tried to outline pretty well, is I'm not sure how the veto system will be impacted if the number of maps is changed.
I am very concerned that what will end up happening is that exposure will be the map taken out in all 3 game modes, and then and they'll say it's because obviously like we're having these issues and we're gonna like kind of come back to it when the devs have fixed it, and it's just gonna I don't know how much it will change, honestly. Like if you take out exposure is not a widely played map. Like obviously it is the most widely played overload map, but that's the least played game mode, so it would actually have the least effect. But if you were to take out like Den, then I think we're kind of cooking at that point, to be honest. Like if you take out Den and Hardpoint and you take out like I mean, I don't want to take out Raid and S&D, but like take out Colossus S&D or Scar S&D. I think that's interesting. I personally believe that the best way to like increase and motivate these players into like being open to new maps is to take away their comfort picks, take away the maps that they're the most comfortable and most played on, and then putting in 2 new maps and leaving in Blackheart. That is a key part of this because Blackheart will get played more if you take out a widely played hardpoint map. I don't know how much it'll change, but I mean, they have to play 2 hardpoints in a 4-game series, so you might get some variety there. But yeah, I hope that it's not just exposure gets taken out. I hope that there is like a pretty I get it. Like if that is just because, you don't want a massive glitch to be just present in the CDL. So if it is the only way that you can solve that, then that, so be it. But I just don't want it to be as easy as that. I would like for pretty much like Scar and Den to be taken out in some form or fashion because that is those are the most common maps that we see, at least like across a 3-game series typically, which I think is what tends to rub people the wrong way is when we get the sweeps and there hasn't been a different map played. Not necessarily like you're always going to get different maps when it's a 5-game series. It's just when you get a 3-0 sweep and you only saw like Scar in that series, you're like, all right, what the fuck are we doing here? Like it sucks. Like, no matter how great a map is, whether it was Raid and Black Ops 2 or Standoff or whatever, like I would like to see variety. I like to see the different maps and how teams play on them. So, but I'm excited. I think this is a good idea. I don't know if Daniel is listening to the Ego Chall podcast, and if he is, then hey, keep it up, man. Like we're relying on you to make some other changes to spice up the CDL. But I think this is a good move. Like you said, like we haven't seen this. I don't know if we've ever seen this. Like I know that there have been more maps than just like the minimum in the past, but like we typically don't even get like 5 good maps in general. So typically it's not like an option for the CDL to have more than 5.
I tried to just go back and look to see specifically in Cold War when Apocalypse got added how the map pool was, but I couldn't find it in time while you were talking. So we'll just have to base it on our memory and not have the fact of previous map pool sizes.
Yeah, I feel like it also is, you can kind of play with your mind because we saw so much map changes over the years. Like we saw maps get swapped out before, and like, you know, we talked about Black Ops 2, like Plaza was just in for like the very early portion of the season.
Yeah.
Same with Yemen. Like those were like the early months of Black Ops 2, and then we never saw them again. And that's why it's like kind of interesting that they could come in Black Ops 7 and actually make an impact in the map pool. And hopefully they do. Hopefully, or, you know, whether it's those two maps or, I mean, if Fringe isn't in, like, we have to like actually fight. Like, this is ridiculous that Fringe. I really liked Gridlock in Black Ops 4 as well. So like, I'm cool with all of those maps kind of coming in and hopefully actually being part of the CDL map pool, starting with the Major 3 qualifiers. I think the last thing that we really should talk about is that the Falcons also might make a roster change, or, you know, that was at least the report. Actually, we have two things to talk about. But again, Ronnie Intel, he was very, very busy over the weekend,
Yeah.
or just all throughout this week. And he reported a few days ago now that the Riyadh Falcons are reportedly considering roster changes for the Major 3 qualifiers. He said that one potential solution they are considering is moving Kismet to his preferred role as an SMG player and bringing in someone from their academy team to fill the flex position. And he said this path would have potentially had either Pred or Exnid step out. And we have spoken at length about this specific issue. We knew all season long, Kismet has even admitted that he has felt uncomfortable in the AR spot. He's the bulldog. He is literally a champ's most valuable player at an SMG. He was, you know, one of the best players just a few years ago when the Subliners won their world championship. But he's been playing out of position all season long. And Exnid specifically has been the guy that we often pointed at, and a lot of people in the community have pointed at as the guy to go if you were to keep Kismet and make a roster change. But Exnid is the remaining Saudi player. He is the only Saudi player on this roster. Falcons very infamously fielded that all Saudi team to start last year, and they were literally the worst CDL team potentially in the history of competitive Call of Duty. He's remained, and I don't think that he is necessarily like a bad player by any means. At certain points, he hasn't even been
the best player right now.
Yeah, like I think that's worth being said. Like he's played pretty well, all things considered, but this team has underperformed, especially when they've gotten to LAN, and I think that is a major, major issue for them. Same thing as we've seen with Carolina. Even though the Falcons have certainly shown like I think a higher ceiling typically than Carolina, but things have to change when you're not able to break through, and we're over halfway through the season. You got some really important stuff coming up with the Major 3 qualifiers, the first minor, Major 3, and then you had the home stretch with the Major 4 and the second minor. So I think it's fair to wonder whether the Falcons should make a move. I don't think that Selim is on the chopping block if his salary is to be believed. I don't know if Pred really is on the chopping block, because you would imagine that he got paid a lot of money and is kind of one of their cornerstones as well. And that's why we've been talking about it's either Exnid or Kismet if they make a roster change. What do you think about potentially being Kismet or I guess Pred to get out of this roster instead of Kismet?
Yeah, I got lots of thoughts and kind of the stuff that you just mentioned too. So I'm going to try and say as much as I can in bullet point form here. But based on the Ronnie Intel report, you mentioned the three names, Kismet, Pred, and Exnid. Selim's name not mentioned at all. So pretty obvious he's not going anywhere, right? Kismet, seemingly them wanting to get him to an SMG. We have talked about that. You mentioned that. I am a huge fan of that being the solution that they say that they try to go with and get him on an SMG. But as you said, and as we've talked about before, it felt like Kismet was always going to be that player who was potentially like the odd man out if they were to make a roster change, just due to Celium's contract, Pred's potential status on the team, and then Exnid being that Saudi presence and everything associated with that. So it felt like Kismet could have been a target regardless of how he played at any point this year. The fact that they are potentially trying to keep him and trying to facilitate the team by moving him to a sub, I think is a good sign for him and his future with this team. Exnid, on the Exnid front, I think it's just crazy that now is potentially the time where they are considering moving him, because as we both mentioned just a couple minutes ago, could argue he has been the best player for them recently. Might not have showed up on LAN for really anyone on the team or him in particular, but especially in the online qualifiers, there were multiple matches where he was just taking over and looked like the best player on the team. So I think it's pretty weird timing in terms of potentially considering moving on from him. But notably, them saying like bringing someone in from the academy team to fill him, it could be another Saudi player like QK. I believe QK is on the Falcons team, but there have been so many challengers, roster changes now I can't keep up with which Falcon. There's like multiple Falcons teams and all that, yada yada. So that brings us to Pred. And I think that the fact that Pred is even being considered for a roster change is very, very interesting. One thing to note is it is probably around this time last year where Pred joined Falcons. So if there wasn't, like, if he just signed, everyone talked about him getting the bag last year, right? In theory, if he didn't like redo his contract or anything in the off season, he could have signed like a 1-year deal around this time last year, and that means the contract could technically be like expiring soon. I don't know the exact timeline on that, but like if it's a 1-year deal, it technically could be coming up here soon. So that would be one interesting avenue, is like they moved on from Pred because like from a contracts perspective, they just don't want to you know, sign him to a 1+1 or whatever, but usually that's an off-season thing and not mid-season thing. But we've never seen like a mid-season move to the reported alleged extent that Pred got his money last year. So I don't know, the fact that either Exnid or Pred is being considered to be replaced on this team just seems absolutely wild to me at this point. It always felt like there was never like a really good answer for who would be the odd man out on this team. It felt like just purely based on tenure in the CDL and historic legacy, whatever you want to say, like it's 3 world champions and then Exnid. It feels like Exnid could be the odd man out just from that like perspective, but he's really played well, and that's what led everyone to seemingly believe that Kismet could be the odd man out. And I think, like you mentioned, Kismet's been playing out a role. They want to see what he can do from as that SMG, and I think it's a disservice to Pred to be like, you know, we're gonna move Kismet to an SMG, but Pred, you don't get the chance to play with this guy who's known for setting up superstar SMGs to succeed even better. Like I feel like if they move Kismet to an SMG and then move off of Pred and don't give Pred the chance to work with the Bulldog, it feels like that's a disservice to Pred and potentially what kind of damage they could do as an SMG duo together. So I think this is a really, really tricky situation for Falcons. I don't know what the answer is or if there is a good answer, but I am definitely interested to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I don't actually think there is a good answer to it because Exnid has overperformed expectations, and he's made a case that he could slide into the role that they probably thought Pred would be in, and then you move Kismet into that second SMG role where he's supporting Exnid. And I actually don't know if that would actually be that bad of an idea. The problem then goes is that you'd have to have an AR replace Kismet, and we talked about like how difficult that can be. So it's actually easier to replace a submachine gun player than it is to replace an AR. And I just don't know what their solution is. Like who can they bring in that is actually going to be like a suitable AR replacement?
I think it's QK.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna because I know that he popped off in challengers recently,
Yeah.
and he's been doing very well. You know, it's risky, obviously, but if they feel that he can be the guy, it's a really hard thing. Like there aren't that many ARs that they can pull in that'll actually be suitable. Obviously, Nasty would be interesting if he could, move away from Boston, but like, yeah, I think it's probably QK. It's probably a challengers player that hasn't had a chance to be in the CDL, which again always goes to the point that we talked about with LAT, or when we were saying about Aluka potentially going to phase early in the season. That's so much pressure to put on a rookie to be like, you are the reason that we're going to either be a middle tier to bottom tier team this season, or we're going to be like a championship contender. That's a lot of pressure to put on him in that spot.
And I just think it's weird from a QK perspective in terms of his dynamic with the team as a Saudi player. He's either, in theory, based on this report, if it is even QK, just for the sake of this example, we'll say it is. If QK replaces Exnid, then he's replacing the other Saudi player, and then it's still one Saudi player, 3 world champions. If QK replaces Pred, he's replacing a world champion, and then you have 2 Saudi players and 2 U.S. players. How does that work from a comms perspective? Obviously, QK has been playing with some Americans. There have been the reports and stuff that people have said of like Falcons paying for English tutoring for the Saudi players and stuff this year, which has been pretty interesting to hear and all that. So I'm not worried about it from a necessarily a communications perspective, because obviously I feel like, Clay and everyone involved with that team, if they were to pull the trigger on inserting QK into the roster, they would have to feel comfortable with how things would work from a communication perspective, or at least be comfortable enough with it to develop as they started getting more reps as a lineup. But yeah, I just think like it's a pretty weird, like in either of those situations, because that's according to running intel, if Pred or Exnid are the potential targets to be replaced, you're either replacing the one Saudi player that's on the team, and you seemingly wanted to keep that Saudi presence if you're Falcons, or you're replacing a former world champion, all-star, MVP candidate, SMG player, and that's a tough spot to be in for anybody filling those shoes.
Yeah, I don't. And they're in a weird spot because it's not like Vancouver or Carolina or one of those teams where you don't really expect very much of them anyway. And if they kind of their goal was to make champs at the end of the day, like there's really no goal above that they can reasonably reach. That is not the case for the Falcons, like even a little bit. The Falcons actually could be a top 4 team and compete for a world championship this year, but they have not put it together completely. Like we just saw, they beat Optic and then they lost the Vancouver Surge. Like that is emblematic of where they are this season, that they can't get out of their own way. They can't consistently win the matches that I think everybody thinks that they should be able to win. So yeah, I really, I don't know. Like I would love to keep Kismet. It doesn't seem like the SMG duo is working with Pred and Exnid, and that's always going to be a concern considering I think they're both like really talented players. Just something isn't clicking, and we've seen that before. But obviously, Kismet has way more experience and at a higher level of being the second SMG than either Exnid or Pred, which would be really funny if Pred was like a second SMG, just considering how he's been his entire career. But it's going to be intriguing. I saw that Clayster basically said that he kind of lashed out at people saying that that he's not working on the team and that he's not trying to make them better, but he certainly, I don't know, like he's in a tough spot, and I would not want to be in his shoes at this point in the season. But they do have a good shot to still obviously make it to champs and compete for a championship if things go right over these last few months. I think other than that, we just have the report that Afro is being considered for the Boston Breach. Of course, the Breach released 2 players, I believe. Well, I don't know if they didn't release Snoopy, but they're going to have to replace two of their players on
Yeah.
this roster. And Afro is apparently being looked at for that SMG spot, replacing Snoopy. What do you think about that? Like, obviously, Afro's gotten a few shots in the CDL at this point. I don't think that he's nearly lived up to the hype after the London Royal Ravens stuff.
Yeah.
But what do you think about him going to Boston potentially?
Yeah, so I think that's the interesting thing. It definitely makes sense. There have been multiple iterations of those London rosters, so I'm not 100% sure on this, but I'm pretty confident in saying that Afro and Nasty played together in the past. So assuming that's the case, like, it makes sense that that would be somebody that Nasty would want to play with again. But the one thing I mentioned when Purge and Snoopy were benched, and we talked about that, was I was interested to see if Boston would take the opportunity to bring in a pre-existing SMG duo, or if they were going to try and just create their own and pluck and play. And it looks like that's potentially the avenue they would be going if they are bringing in Afro. Also, um, I don't. I'm pretty sure Afro wasn't on one of the Omit rosters, and now there's that whole Omit Boston reported partnership. So it's also interesting that a non-Omit player is potentially being targeted here. But either way, I was excited with Afro getting an opportunity earlier this year with Cloud9. Um, Obviously, that didn't work out, but seemingly with Beans potentially being targeted by Vancouver, and now Boston potentially targeting Afro. That C9 opportunity likely gave those guys the visa required to still be a potential option for some of these teams, whereas opposed to if they didn't have that opportunity early in the year, they likely aren't getting these reported opportunities. So I think that's, at least that's one win for Cloud9 in the sense of how things worked out for them and their roster early in the year. But nonetheless, yeah, I think it is an interesting thing to think about in terms of Afro going from potentially not getting an opportunity over these last couple of years to now he's going to get a shot potentially on two teams in the same season. And I kind of worry that, like, if this doesn't work out for him, it could really be one of his last shots, because it feels like he's one of those players who's done really well in challengers, and then like you said, he had um a pretty strong early stint with London, and then after that, it kind of just wasn't the same for him, and wasn't, went down to challengers, and we heard good things about him, but now it would be he comes back to the CDL, and it's not the same success. So I'm kind of worried that, like, if things don't work out for him in the second shot here this year, that it could be one of his last opportunities. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken about that. Like, once you get to like 4 or 5 teams, then like it seems pretty unlikely that you're going to get to 6 or 7, especially because you're probably not going to get to Optic and FaZe and LAT and stuff. So like those teams, and I think he was also on LAT already, so he's kind of across that bridge. Yeah, so I think this is probably going to be, if he does get on Boston, this might be his last shot. Interested to see how it works out for Boston. I don't know how they're going to kind of turn this around. This is a really big undertaking. I think they have two good players in Spartan Nasty that seem to be working well together, but the rest of the team wasn't working well, and they were one of the worst teams, and they remain one of the worst teams in the CDL. I don't know how much Afro actually moves the needle in that regard. I don't know how much anybody really moves the needle in that regard, because they're just like, it's a tough job to get them out of like that 10th, 11th spot that they've been hovering around, and moving them into like a comfortable champs position. So we'll have to wait and see who, along with Afro potentially, could come to the Boston Breach before the Major 3 qualifiers. But that does it for us. Again,
Nope.
Happy Easter to everyone. Is that not it?
Nope. As of 15 minutes ago, CDL Intel just reported that Fire 40 might be getting a trial with the Carolina Royal Ravens.
All right, I don't know what to do with that.
I do.
Okay.
I think that is super fascinating, because he's obviously played very well in challengers with Bush, and that could bring everything full circle with what we talked about earlier. If somebody on Bush leaves, I think Capsidal is immediately picked right back up with Bush, and I think that's like a kind of full circle way because we were talking about that probably an hour ago. Obviously, this is just a trial though, but I think from a pure, like initial reaction to this report from, I would assume it's Crone, but I'm not 100% sure if Crone's still doing that with the CDL intel, but it's his sources or potentially the account sources. So, um, either way, I'm interested to Fire, and this is, we're talking about it with Afro. Fire was that guy. He got the one shot with the Paris Legion back in Cold War, and he hasn't sniffed another opportunity since then. So this would be a long time coming for him to get another CDL opportunity, and I would be interested to see if it works out. I don't know how much it moves the needle for Carolina, but he has played pretty well in Challengers, so I think he is deserving of an opportunity. But again, this is just a reported trial, nothing confirmed there.
Yeah, we'll have to kind of check base on a lot of these because just a lot of reports and rumors going around, but hopefully, potentially, we might get some confirmations in the near future about roster changes. Like I was saying before, Fire 40 so rudely interrupted. Happy Easter to everybody who celebrates. We should be back, I think, in the middle of the week because I won't be here next weekend. So I want to make sure that we get in a show before that weekend. But we really appreciate everybody stopping by and watching or listening. Please make sure to subscribe or like or follow the podcast feed wherever you're watching on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and YouTube. I mean, we were talking about it before, but the YouTube video from this past podcast and the one before that just blew up out of nowhere. It was like at 200 views before we started this show, which was very quick and very unexpected, but we appreciate all that kind of support. If you want to watch these streams live, instead of just listening or watching after the fact, you can do so on YouTube, or you can do it at twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can follow and or subscribe on Twitch. While you're there, you can go over to twitch.tv/jbink with 2Ks, and you can follow there and subscribe there as well. Again, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're at 294 the last time I checked, so only 6 subscribers away from 300. I would really appreciate if we were able to get to that, potentially before the Major 3 qualifiers, because we've been increasing pretty steadily in the last few weeks there. You can follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcasters at Ego Chall Podcast. And again, I think that the next show will probably be the middle of this week. But we'll, if you want to make sure, then you just have to follow, and the feed will refresh when we have put out a new episode. I think that's it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in and all the support. Really appreciate it. In typical Ego Chall tradition, and at least of late, we came into a show with not a ton to talk about, and we found a way to still yap about it for a long time. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I think we definitely had some good stuff to talk about and made some good points, but I'll leave that up to you guys to decide. But yeah, like Preston said, we should be back at some point soon, and hopefully we have even more ROSTERMANIA stuff to talk about. And then, before you know it, matches are back in 12 days. So we have to get some of these rosters confirmed. We have to get the map pool stuff confirmed, and then we will have to do our power rankings once those rosters are all set in stone and everything. So it should be a fun couple of weeks here, but matches will be back pretty soon. So yeah, I don't think got anything else. Hope everyone has a good Easter for everybody celebrating. Hope everyone has a good rest of the day and everything like that. And remember to send the chow.